Okay, so our first speaker is Dr. Maya Gislason, who is an associate professor of health sciences at Simon Fraser University, where she leads the research for Eco-Social and Equitable Transformation Lab, or RESET Lab. Our second speaker, oh, and the more extensive bios are in the chat where you can kind of see a more fulsome description of the speakers. Our second speaker, Angel Kennedy, is the research manager for the RESET Lab and works with Maya. She is a PhD candidate at SFU and researcher for the Environment Community Health Observatory Network and an early career coordinator for the EcoHealth International. And finally, Dr. Alison Shaw joined SFU as Executive Director of Action on Climate Team and is currently the inaugural Executive Director for SFU Climate Innovation, a critical research priority in the university's strategic research plan. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Maya.
Thank you so much. It is a real treat to be here. I'm just sharing my screen with you. And want to, sorry, and am going to really just take a moment to bring us into this space of co-creation, a space where a space that describes a lot of the work that we're already doing together, and you'll receive stories and more examples of this kind of co-creation work. But I think for me, co-creation is this incredible concept that we're coming here together to think about. It's a concept that involves huge, big scale thinking that takes us back to the beginning of time. It invokes this notion of who we are and what we are capable of as people, creating and reimagining our worlds today. But it also is a way of thinking about the world that we are endeavoring to envision in the future. And creativity and collaboration create this kind of unique co-creative impulse that we're going to talk about today. Sorry. So a lot of the examples that you all work in already, examples that you will hear about today, are rooted in this notion of wicked problems. And we know wicked problems to be these problems that are very hard to define, to work on. They're very difficult to quantify. And when we move into these complex systems and try something out, they have many unintended consequences. And then super wicked problems like climate change, are being addressed, or people are trying to, the same people who created the problems are trying to solve them. And so we bring up a lot of questions right now about, what are the tools and the thinking and the frameworks that we're bringing to the table to deal with these kinds of issues. And so we place ourselves within the context of wicked problems and have a lot of humility about that, because we know that these problems, the ones that are on our plates today, took a long time to make. They bring together, in the context of climate change, for example, the interaction between ecological and social systems. And so we need to be thinking about, how we got here, but also what are our transition pathways out. And so this is just an invocation of kind of where we are and what is on our plates. So co-creation itself is thought of as a way to do an intervention that changes the way that things are done, that we imagine and work together. It's more than collaboration. It's even more than engagement. It's about this incredible synergy that comes from bringing minds together. And one of the other key features of co-creation is that we're trying to work from the bottom up. We're trying to bring the voices of people who are deeply involved in the issues, who will be the end users, for example, the citizens within the context of climate change, and that we are paying close attention to the whole developmental process. And so one of the other things that we really appreciate about the co-creative process is that the field that this work takes place in is very important, and that the modes of action, the ways of thinking that we bring together are the ones that actually catalyze change. And so how we do that work has a direct impact on the kinds of possibilities for change and transformation that are invoked through these interactions. And so sometimes with co-creation, we think a lot about design and design principles. And these kinds of ideas around co-creation have a long legacy. They go back to the beginning of time. As I said, we can follow them into the work that was happening in Scandinavia. We can look at how it's come into North America. We can think about things like human-centered design. But a lot of these things have really been talking about how we approach the design or project intervention process. And co-creation is very much about answering who designs as well. And so there's a very important critical social justice decolonizing impulse to this co-creative space. And when we look into different methodologies, and people can define what co-creation is in many different kinds of a way, but what I really love about this is that sometimes when we're looking at the big problems of our day and trying to figure out how do we actually make tangible, impactful change? How do we, for example, plan for a future that we cannot yet see and that we don't have some consensus around? The co-creative approach will say, okay, we begin by speaking with one another. We begin by listening. We begin by beginning. And through the first task, which is really to talk, to listen, to tell our very authentic stories, we begin to understand the world and the issue through different people's experiences and perspectives. And it's in this deep truth naming process that a different kind of creative imagination begins to emerge, an imagination that's rooted in the soil of our own lives and experiences, and that grows into something that could actually make a big difference, for example, creating sustainable futures. And then this is a spiral of co-creation. As I said, there's many different methodologies, but the idea is that we listen and then we name things. We name causes of causes, we name impacts, and through that naming, we connect with one another. We find our shared values. And in this current era where we are connected as a global community, we can actually really do this kind of work traversing the globe. And then we nourish these processes and we co-create and we illuminate and we amplify. And so there's a really profound impulse or heartbeat beating at the center of this work. And one thing that a lot of people talk about within the co-creative space, and a thought that I want to leave you with, because I'm really wanting to just offer some framing thoughts, and then you'll hear more stories of concrete practice from Angel and Alison, is that when we co-create, when we really think carefully about these kinds of processes, some are saying that this is a way that humanity is becoming a collective witness to its own journey and to the consequences of its collective action. And we know this to be true when we're contemplating and responding, for example, to anthropogenic and anthropogenically driven climate change, but also when we're working, for example, within the context of planetary health and those planetary boundaries. And what this co-creative impulse is also inviting us is to open up and work together to develop and action new possibilities for consciously choosing the direction of our futures. And so it's a very exciting space. I'm very excited that you have a chance to hear some of the really interesting work that's happening both here at SFU, but also reaching across the planet. And I look forward to having a fulsome discussion as this webinar unfolds. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. That was, yeah, that was really beautiful. That last closing thought of being a collective witness to the consequences of our collective actions. It's such a succinct way to put it. Okay, I will pass it over to Angel.
Thank you. Sharing my screen here. Okay, so I'm really honored to be here. I'm so excited that so many people are interested in co-creation. And so I wanted to take some time to share 3 examples of co-creation initiatives in climate research that I, and importantly Maya, have helped organize and run that span global, national, and local or community scales. And as I describe each one, I'll touch on what I think made them successful, but also what I learned about implementing co-creation in research through each of them. So this first event that's up here takes us to the global scale. For 2 years now, this year will be the 3rd, I've led an effort with a group of early career individuals around the world on working together for a healthy, just, and sustainable future. We had our first event in November of 2022, and our second one was in November of 2023. So the event was 24 hours of conversations that took place over 34 hours and across 11 regions around the world. So in 2023, we had over 80 panelists talk and over 600 people register, about just over 300 attended. And there's a photo here of the polar steps that I created with summaries of the discussions that occurred in each region, as well as photos and resources that were shared. And the top left photo here is a Padlet that I created for participants and registrants to share resources, reflections, insights about this theme to bring everyone into the space of co-creating what it meant to work together for a healthy, just, and sustainable future. And in this event, we really centered the idea of connection and conversation across regions instead of presentations or conference style information sharing. So there was a level of dialogue that doesn't always happen in these really large settings. And when I first dreamed up this event with a UNBC colleague, Margot Parks, and with Maya, we really weren't sure how this would play out or what kind of uptake it would have, especially with how busy everyone is and the complex unfoldings around the world at any given time. And so we were really ready to do the planning to hold this space for these conversations to happen, with the acknowledgement that if there wasn't a lot of uptake, or if this wasn't the time, or if people weren't interested in this space, that we wouldn't do it. And so we started reaching out to people, and there was an immediate excitement about this move away from conference style presentations and to connecting globally about local work and really showcasing local approaches to this global idea of working together for a healthy, just, and sustainable future in each region. So when reflecting on what I think made it successful, there was it was early career, colleague designed and run. There was a group on the bottom right here who were really pivotal in the 2023 context. And having all of our connections from around these different watersheds really help link these global efforts and unify local context realities of how planetary health is showing up in place. We brought in local and regional music at the beginning of each session to ground in place. And we had a lot of support from established career colleagues as well. So in each of the regions, we could bring together these intergenerational connections and came together around a common theme or vision, but was really flexible with and celebrated the many different approaches that different regions around the world are taking in this work. And by leaving this co-creation process up to each of the regions, we would attend planning meetings, but took an approach of just being there to support the idea generation and to help logistically set up whatever each region wanted to do. But the design of each session and the content was completely up to the different regions. So for example, East Oceania, which was mostly New Zealand at the time, brought in Maori voyaging stories and photos. And Turtle Island had an explicit focus on creating an intergenerational panel that also brought in a lot of Indigenous colleagues working across Turtle Island. So that's on the global scale. And then moving down to this national scale, Maya is a co-PI on this project, and I'm one of the original trainees for the CERi funded project called the ECHO Network, which is this pan-Canadian network focused on strengthening intersectoral capacity to understand and respond to the health impacts of resource development across the country. And in doing this national work, we also had these regional cases in which researchers and organizations and community members in each region would partner and create these like regional cases that could work on things that were place specific. So the one that we were really part of was the SFU and First Nations Health Authority regional case. And this on the screen here was a photo created by our amazing colleague, Cody Thomas, who was trying to illustrate what we learned during our time working on the ECHO Network together. And the really big things that came up in this complicated space of working across sectors and across scales and across watersheds in BC was the role of trust in designing what this work looked like, bringing everyone together to do the best that we could, celebrating the strength that we all bring into this space, and also knowing what we don't need to bring along with us. We had this canoeing analogy, and so there's some language in there around figuring out what we toss overboard. This co-creation process was very challenging. It happened during the pandemic. We got stuck in eddies was the language that we had on the left-hand side here, where we weren't focused on moving down the river. It was more an unlearning and relearning process, intentional circular learning, and really sitting with the challenges to make sure that we weren't slipping into doing things the same way that created the challenges in the first place. Another major co-creation challenge, I think, for this project was that there was so much overturn. So we had a lot of people who were really central to holding the pieces together who would move on in this really big project. And so onboarding and being flexible about the project and the direction changing based off the new voices that we had coming into the space was something that I think we really learned to do. And was an interesting outcome, I think, of this co-creation. And now going to the local level, these are graphic recordings from Karina Keeling for an event that I helped coordinate with Maya and in partnership with Cowichan Tribes and the ECHO Network. And this gathering brought together community and environmental government, health authority, research colleagues, youth, all to come together as a whole to address critical connections about climate and health and water and community and health. And this is something that Dr. Shannon Waters really wanted to host for a long time with Chief Lydia Whitsom, but they didn't have the resources at the time to quite convene it yet. And so we were in a meeting and they talked about this desire to host something like this, and we partnered with them to try to bring it all together and co-design this. So the gathering was centered around the key principle of coming together as a whole to work together to be stronger as partners for the watershed, which is a Cowichan Watershed Board governance ancient principle. And so through a series of connected conversations, we talked about alignments between the Drinking Water Protection Act legislative review and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, for example, and really celebrated the land and water and climate-based initiatives that were already happening in the Cowichan region. And so for this co-creation project really amplifying the work that Cowichan Tribes was already doing, and bringing our connections together to get the sectors and people in the room that they were wanting to meet with was a really big part of this co-creation. Showing up with intentionality to lift up the voices of people who weren't typically at these decision-making seats, but then bringing in people who are part of decision-making seats was something that we all wanted to be really intentional about. And that included bringing youth and a class from Northern BC to this gathering as well. So I'll leave it there. But thank you for listening. I'm excited for the conversation that comes after.
Thank you so much, Angel. Wow, it's I feel like we've been talking for a few months, but I haven't known about your work in that level of depth. So it was really wonderful to hear about it. And what kept coming to mind for me was just this idea of research as community organizing, and how research can really work as this facilitator of relationships and movement. And yeah, and I love the visualizations that you're doing and incorporating the nature as a metaphor in them as well. Thank you so much. Okay, so we'll move on to our third and final speaker, Alison Shaw.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. My name is Alison Shaw. As mentioned, I'm the new executive director of SFU Climate Innovation, which is based on community-engaged approaches, as was outlined by Tara at the beginning. And I'm also wearing a second hat as the executive director of the Action on Climate team here at SFU as well. And I'm just very thrilled to be here in this esteemed company, as well as grateful to be living, working, and playing on the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations territories. We're all talking about climate change and co-creation today. And of course, we know that future climate impacts depend on choices that are made today. And the way that these futures are communicated, or the uncertainty around these futures, is usually through scientifically robust information, which comes in these types of graphics that we've all seen and are familiar with. You know, different lines, different pathways, different potential futures, but really critical decision points. And that's where the lines start to converge from each other. And so it's a really intense moment in time for decision makers, scientists, community members, households, for thinking about the types of decisions that we make now that will help to build and construct our collective vision for the future. And so, you know, I've been in climate change and climate action research now for over 25 years, initially working at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scale, the international scale, and now working at the local scale. And one thing that's come from my experience is the understanding that we've got to overcome the concept that truth speaks to power. We have to understand that science has an incredible role to play in solutions building, but that this type of communication to policymakers and diverse audiences has not been effective. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, more recently in their reports, has started to be reflexive about exactly this understanding that you know, science has a role to play, but not the only role in moving communities and nations to action. And so they've been calling for pathways and transitions and systems, all kinds of different language around what needs to happen in order to move forward under a changing climate. And so this is really interesting to me, because in my career trajectory, I've been focused on, you know, kind of the intermingling of facts and values, and how facts and epistemic communities, such as scientists that build facts and understand how this really amazing epistemological approach of science works, are helping us build knowledge about the world. And yet epistemic communities like policymakers or community members have values that either accept, reject, or kind of reshape those facts. And so this is kind of the stymied situation that we've found ourselves in the climate world, where action is moving far too slowly, and it doesn't matter how urgent the science becomes, it's not shaping the policy, it's not shaping residents' choices in the ways that we would have hoped. And this comes back to Maya's comment around wicked problems, and the concept of wicked problems emerged in the 70s actually, but really got traction in the 90s from Funkowitz and Rivets, talking about post-normal science. So science that has incredible systems uncertainties around it, and with high decision stakes, where historical trends are insufficient to forecast futures, and where both facts and futures are underdetermined. And so we, in our work in this point in history, are living in a realm of post-normal science, and we're trying to figure out what that means and what that looks like. And so the concept of post-normal science is, let's get beyond truth speaks to power, fact speaks to policy, and move into fit for purpose knowledge making, especially for the decision-making realm, where we actually open up the scientific inquiry. We open scientific problem framing to broader audiences, where we build more extended peer-reviewed communities to help us frame problems and figure out how to develop evidence to support solving those problems. And so in the process of fit for purpose knowledge making, we're actually bringing communities, as Maya said, communities or end users or, residents into the scientific inquiry process to ensure that the questions that we're asking and the processes that we're designing to answer those questions are relevant and socially robust. And doing so is necessary in this era of an uncertain future. We can't wait for scientists to tell us how to move into our future. They don't have the values and the kind of moral authority to do that, nor do policymakers have the evidence and the facts and all of the tools that they need. So there's lots of different roles for different epistemic communities to play. And so co-creation is really about bringing those epistemic communities together to name things, as Maya said. I really liked that, Maya. To come together, name things, and move forward in more streamlined directions. So I just wanted to share with you today a project that I think kind of demonstrates the co-creation approach. That it's a project called the Integrated Climate Action for BC Communities Initiative that took place from 2018 to 2021. And it was the Action on Climate team at SFU that designed and implemented essentially this piece of work. It's action research, but really co-creation research. And I just wanted to give you a little glimpse into why this research is interesting in terms of kind of bringing co-creation to the fore. So we worked with 10 municipal partner communities across the province of BC, and the goal was to co-create and embed low carbon resilience approaches into community planning, asset management, and corporate strategy, or essentially anywhere that the community saw fit. And low carbon resilience, for those of you that may not be familiar, is an approach where we're overcoming knowledge silos around adaptation and mitigation and sustainability. And we're looking for intersections in approaches that actually reduce climate risks and emissions while also advancing sustainability co-benefits, such as equity, biodiversity, economic development, whatever the values of our particular partners are. And so the goal of this project was to say, what does it look like to reduce risk, emissions, and advance sustainability co-benefits in 10 different municipalities? And we essentially brought together cross-disciplinary, cross-departmental teams and relevant stakeholder partners in each of the 10 communities to talk about exactly this question. What types of projected impacts is your community going to see? And how do we reduce the risks of those impacts? And collectively thinking about how to reduce the risks of those impacts in a way that also reduces emissions and advances other sustainability goals. So the co-creation research approach was really about bringing, the policymakers, some of the relevant groups, social groups from the communities, and ancillary kind of institutions like the health authorities, into helping understand the climate problem, so best available climate projections for their community, and to explore what that meant for their community and what it meant for their community in terms of being able to adapt and build resilience over time, as well as what it meant to reduce emissions. And so we took this cross-departmental, cross-sectoral team through a whole research approach where we defined the problems, we named what the potential impacts could be, we co-created scenarios of the future based on best available information that comes from the science as well as from their local knowledges. And over the course of 3 years, helped to move the planning, the climate action planning toward implementation by building on the values that emerged out of this work with these teams. And so that looked very different across each of the 10 municipalities. Some of the municipalities were interested in using nature-based solutions to amplify amplify their adaptation to climate change. Some were changing their governance structures so that they were more agile to meet the challenges as they emerged. Different communities, took this process and ran with it in completely unique ways. But part of what happened throughout the co-creation process was they built shared understanding, shared responsibility, and shared accountability for solutions building and implementation. And so really, at the end of the day, co-creation is inclusive. It's about including the appropriate epistemic communities, evidence, scientists with their evidence, policymakers with their values and representations, and community members with their unique needs, especially those that are most vulnerable to projected climate impacts, and building new visions of the future based on all of those values, and doing so in a way that models adaptive management approaches so that we're we're also always kind of implementing, then monitoring and evaluating what's working and what's not working and refining it over time, or in 5 years' time, throwing it out altogether and starting over. So
Alison, I'm just gonna jump in because we're at our Q&A part. If you could talk maybe 1 more minute, or we could jump into the Q&A now.
no, that's fine. I just wanted to finish off with one more slide, which is about the innovative potential of co-creation. And so it's 7 key areas of potential that I identified, where problem framing and ensuring the relevance of research, making transparent facts, evidence, and values in decision processes, attending to power imbalances, exploring a wide range of solutions and alternatives, shifting the burden of proof against proponents of harmful activities. So instead of innocent until proven guilty, guilty until proven innocent, co-identifying preventative actions in the face of uncertainty, and strengthening our trust in our democratic institutions moving forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I feel like we could do a whole webinar just on this work. And yeah, I learned so much. I hadn't come across post-normal science. I hadn't come across that term before, but it goes a long way to kind of explaining the moment that we're in. And I always love a good list. And so I screenshotted your innovative potential of co-creation, and I especially liked the shifting the burden of proof for polluting entities to be assumed guilty until proven innocent. I love that. Sad reality, but anyway. Okay, so we're going to jump into some Q&A. I had one question that I just really wanted to ask the 3 of you. And Alison, you sort of touched on it with the burden of proof comment and this post-normal science. But I think it's relevant to the 3 topics you all were discussing. And that's kind of this idea of like, and it comes up a lot in community engagement, which is like power versus trust, or power and trust. So is it with co-creation, to what extent, obviously power dynamics are at play, but like Angel, in your work, it seemed like it was communities, and I think this is true, is like communities are just kind of doing stuff, at different levels. They're just getting to work to some extent, and making things happen. And that's like, at a grassroots level, that's like in universities and organizations, but then you inevitably come up against decision making. And so, and not that is necessarily a barrier, but like, how have your experiences been in terms of like, when it comes to that decision making point, how does co-creation potentially change those dynamics, or does it? Because often we hear a community will have gone through a process and be committed to that process and excited about it, and then it gets to the decision making point and their work is kind of thrown out because some other factor that comes in, or the government changes, or something happens, and then the work that the community did isn't acknowledged or isn't brought into the fold. So I'm just kind of wondering about that sort of dynamic in this.
I can speak to that. I think it's a very powerful tool. I think co-creation research is what I'm interested in. And there's lots of ways that people are using co-creation, for community building, for social movement building, for business, for, product development. So co-creation is being used in all kinds of different realms. And I think that the potential of it for the relationship between science and policy is enormous, because what we've come to understand is that power dynamic. And so opening up our institutions and our systems to account for diverse values and diverse knowledges is not only a way to overcome the stymied situations that we find ourselves in facing these wicked problems, but also is a pathway to building and strengthening our democratic institutions, which have lost their, their kind of grounding and foundations. So I really see climate action as an opportunity to, take the best of the institutions that we're working in and recreate them so that they're working on behalf of communities moving forward.
May I jump in too and offer, like, thank you so much for the question, and Alison for your thoughts. For me too, co-creation, as you said, Alison, it can be so many different things. And I think back in terms of power, to my training in actually popular theater and popular education, and working a lot in first international context, but then also in Canadian context. And I think one of the impulses, and partly why I shared this idea of it's like bottom-up solutioning, even though that's not necessarily how it's used in product development, although it has been, where you get together everyone who is part of that product chain, from the people who create it to use it to want to market it and come up with a solution. It is actually very innovative. But sitting in community with people using that kind of Paulo Freirean impulse, where we are the experts in our own experience, where we really do know, because we're living them, the impacts of the power inequities and the structural forms of discrimination and so on. We know how they're impacting us. And so our story is rich and kind of organically intersectional. But also our solutions are ranging from our individual lives and choices up through to structural changes. And, working, for example, in Latin America with a lot of small scale farmers dealing with petrochemical and agrochemical companies and so on. So that kind of sitting on the ground and looking up into that international fora is part of the co-creation space. And when we actually story our experience, because storytelling is really, for me, at the center of co-creation, when we story our experience and our location within an issue, and really listen to that kind of intimate beginning, I think that co-creative process kind of inculcates or invites people into the space with a different role, which is to create a solution rather than to come in as an expert or this or that. And I think that's one of the kind of secret magic ingredients of the co-creation recipe.
I love that, Maya. And I'll just add a small point. I think also what I've really heard in all of these different settings is a need for accountability, and building that into the co-creation process so things don't start and end with no follow-up and no accountability to the intention that went into the planning process as well.
Yeah, implementation is the key component of co-creation. It's a planning to implementation approach. So it's not just about planning and letting the thoughts sit on a shelf. It's really about, okay, let's roll up our sleeves, and how is this going to work, and how are we going to collectively shape the solution in the future? Yeah.
Thank you for those answers. Just to build on that, we know we have one question in the chat that I'm going to get to, and please feel free, folks, to put your questions in the Q&A if you have them. So given all that, the answers that you just gave, how do you see the role of, like, the university as an institution, but also faculty and grad students, like what is the role of our community in that, or the people, not everybody here is affiliated with the university, but what role can the university and people within the university play in co-creation? Like there's kind of the obvious potentially a convener role, but what are the other roles that you all see the university playing or academics playing in this?
I'll let Maya take that, given you're the academic that's been doing it.
Yeah. There's so many different roles. I mean, I think Tara and Joanna, you could speak a lot about the role that CERi is playing in that, and some of the examples you opened with are amazing examples. I think that a couple of examples for me are, for example, I think that we do a resource distribution role as well, and certainly a convening role, but also a responsive role. So many times when we're working, for example, on climate change, there are, and working a lot with Indigenous communities or with new folks, for example, who are responding as climate leads in the health authority context. We have so many pressures from the ground up around climate impacts, risk and disaster realities, and so on. We have so many expectations placed from government onto these positions, and just a real lack of resourcing. And one of the resources that's needed is knowledge, is just lit reviews and the ability to convene people in accessible spaces, and the ability to listen to questions that come from community and answer them with evidence that can then get cycled back into a policy development or a communication with government or whatever. So I feel that we are trying to build really authentic partnerships where we have very direct and responsive and collaborative relationships with our partners, whether they're the government, whether they're a community, but very much being engaged in this change-making transformative impulse. So I guess that's the part that we do, is really are selective about where we put our energy and resources, and are value-driven. And I think that's one of the principles of co-creation as well, is that we are very value-driven in terms of being interested scientists who want to make this a better place, this world.
I see that you have your hand up, Joanna, but is it on this topic? Because I'd like to.
Well, I had another question, but if you wanted to add to that, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just add to Maya. Thank you, Maya. That was a wonderful response. And I just would be remiss if I didn't mention SFU Climate Innovation and what SFU is wanting to do in the co-creation space, and has hired me to help facilitate. So I feel like higher education has an incredible role to play in moving co-creation forward, and that means overcoming a lot of institutional norms in the academic setting, and encouraging cross-disciplinary collaboration and interdisciplinary collaboration on real-world problem solving. So that in and of itself is the trajectory of the modern university. And I think there's a tremendous role for universities to be playing to bring the capacities, the research capacities, and the expertise and intelligence to bear in community problem solving with community. So that's actually one of the research priorities of the university right now. And the other piece of that is the knowledge mobilization piece. So universities have an incredible role to play in evaluating solutions and really kind of attempting to understand what's working and what's not working, and mobilizing that knowledge, but also identifying scalable innovation and scalable knowledge and ensuring that that gets communicated through our academic networks, but also through other networks in order to support more accelerated solutions building. So that's what I'd like to add there.
Can I just jump in with a question and just an observation on what I heard? Some incredible storytelling about specific cases where co-creation has played such an important role. And I'm wondering, when it comes to communication, which I think all of you have touched on how important it is to find that kind of junction between scientific evidence, between values, between emotions. How do we construct the kinds of stories that you think will actually move the dial in a way that we need to? What are some of the ways that you're experimenting with? And I know there's people on the call. I see Cam Razavi, whose research on climate change stories and narratives is really, I think, very powerful. I think others are doing research into that. But I'd love to hear, like, what do you think that the sort of the formula is to communicating out the kinds of solutions and evidence in a way that is actually going to land and create change at the levels that we need change to occur? Maya, I see you're shaking your head and wondering what your thoughts are.
Thanks, Joanna. My goodness. I mean, it's a powerful question. I would love to hear from the room as well. And I'm just looking also in the Q&A, Omri, the question you're asking about, you know, the tensions that arise. So I don't know. I mean, regarding communication, knowledge mobilization, implementation, science, all of those kinds of things. And Omri, in your question, you're asking also about bringing in consensus-based methods for decision making, which I think is part of the storying process. I mean, when we look at climate communication science, we're realizing that different populations need different kinds of messaging. And we definitely know that we need to involve people, bring them into spaces based on what's important to them, but also what's happening in their local contexts and realities. And, you know, I've just come out of a meeting actually around vaccine hesitancy and a lack of trust in science more generally, and this notion of misinformation. So, you know, I think we live in a time of radical diversity in terms of our sources of information, our belief systems, our experiences. And so I think generally I'm very much trying to work at very regionalized scales on really concrete issues and concrete solutions, working in ways that we have kind of proof of concept sort of solutions that we're proposing to people, particularly in situations of transformation where the risks to people's security, sovereignty, housing, all that stuff are pretty present. Yeah. And I think also working across generations is really important because we speak different languages, experience things differently, have a different sense of past, present, and future, and therefore what's important to us. So I'd say like a high degree of diversity in strategy and communication is one of the things that we're working with right now.
I would just add to that, to Omri's question, also tech decision-making platforms can go a long way in this. So I'm thinking of Lumio or Othello, which is a platform developed by a local activist here in Vancouver. allow for, I think, to speed up some decision-making processes and allow them to be more transparent, so you can see who said what and how that leads to the next decision, and then how. I'm not sure if you use that in your process, but just to add that little piece to Maya's excellent and involved and much more sophisticated answer than mine. But I always, it's like, what are the tech tools out there that can enhance these things as well? I'm just seeing another question in the chat. Someone is asking, what roles can undergraduate students play that are interested in this field and want to make the world a better place?
Angel, do you want to answer that? I'd say lots and lots of things.
So I think there's different scales of this too. So it can really be a bridge of your interests and where you think the world needs to go and how you want to be connecting in these spaces. But I think there's lots of things happening at SFU, like the initiative with CERi, hiring grad students, for example, but also there are lots of undergraduate convening sites as well. And then moving outside of the university, like the Earth Hug events, those are open to all and any, for example. So feel free to contact me if that's something you're interested in. I don't know. I know I see the time, so I'll leave it.
There's a lot, yeah. And reaching out to people and organizations and professors and groups that are speaking to the passions you have and getting involved. And I think the other thing is not waiting to be asked, but actually knocking on doors.
Yeah, I second that. Just approach anybody in your life who's already working on these issues and ask them what they're doing. And yeah. We have another question from Roger here. So this will be our last question. And he's asking, as part of solutions, what are you investigating opportunities and the need for reduction of consumption, such as reduce energy use, not just substitute electricity for fossil gas or driving less, options not versus EVs for everyone. So kind of like a degrowth approach as part of the suite of solutions. Is that part of co-creation work? And we have
Roger, I can
1 minute.
I can speak to that just briefly. That is a critical part of the information that the researchers can bring into co-creation spaces is, the diverse suite of opportunities to make change, and consumption and production are one of those areas. Driving less, but also ensuring that, transportation options are available to those that need it, those types of things. I just wanted to mention that there's a great co-creation process on transportation right now at SFU that's focusing on getting beyond EVs and really trying to build multimodal transportation for neighborhoods, and embedding intersectionality approaches into that as well, looking at particularly vulnerable populations and really trying to build in the needs of those populations into new transportation models. So it kind of skirts around the question, but we're looking at kind of innovative solutions building in those types of ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Roger, for the question. Okay, we're at the end of our time together. We wanted to ask one more poll question to see if folks had any suggestions on what they would like to see more of in terms of connecting climate change and co-creation research. So we're going to put that poll. Up, and so just feel free to answer it. It's a short answer question, and we'll use that to design our next offering. And that will likely come in the fall. There's a small chance there could be something in the summer, but it's kind of hard to wrangle folks in the summer. So, but the fall for sure. And if you want to stay up to date on our events and offerings, please subscribe to our newsletter. That'll come up in the chat as well. And also for the grad students on the call, the SFU grad students, we'll be opening up applications for our graduate fellowship program at the end of May. So that's open to all grad students. It includes a $3,000 stipend and monthly workshops on community engaged research from September to April. And with that, I would just like to thank our amazing speakers, Angel, Maya, and Allison. Thank you so much for your wisdom and your time today. And we'll see you all next time. Please be in touch if you have any further questions.
Thank you, everyone.